The night the truth finally showed its teeth began with a sound no heart should ever hear, a frail old woman whispering a prayer not for her own life, but for the strength to endure the cruelty of someone meant to protect her. Mama Ruth's trembling voice floated through the silent mansion like a wounded bird looking for a home, yet no one cared enough to listen. Her hands, once steady and strong from raising her only son alone, now shivered as she clutched the edge of the cold marble counter for balance. A woman who had given nothing but love stood in a house filled with everything except kindness, and that was the first sign that something in this world was terribly, painfully broken. Selena stood across from her, arms folded, expression sharp enough to slice through the air. She had mastered the art of sweetness around Adrien, gentle voice, soft smile, modest charm, but the moment he boarded his flight, the mask fell so easily it was frightening. Her voice was coated with mockery as she looked Mama Ruth up and down. "You're moving too slowly again," she said, every word dipped in contempt. "Old people should know their place." The words were not shouted, they were whispered with poisonous confidence, the kind that hurts more because the speaker knows the victim cannot fight back. Mama Ruth lowered her head, choosing silence instead of conflict, her chest tightening with a pain she refused to name. The mansion, with its golden lights and polished floors, had never felt so cold. Every corridor echoed differently now, no longer with Adrien's laughter, but with Selena's footsteps, crisp and sharp, pacing like a predator inspecting her territory. Mama Ruth tried to prepare tea, her movements gentle and familiar, but Selena snatched the cup from her hand and poured the hot liquid straight into the sink. "He's not here," she hissed. "You don't get to play mother of the house when Adrien isn't watching." The cruelty was calculated, intentional, and worst of all, practiced. It felt like something she had waited patiently to release. Later that afternoon, the house staff moved quietly, choosing not to interfere, yet their eyes lingered long enough for guilt to settle. They had always adored Mama Ruth, but Selena had threatened their jobs with a single sentence: "Speak, and you lose everything." Fear has a way of silencing even the kindest souls. So they watched from the corners, watched as Mama Ruth's meals were taken away, watched as she was ordered to stand for hours, watched as she was denied even the chair she had always used when her legs ached. And all the while, Mama Ruth prayed that Adrien would return soon, not because she wanted to expose Selena, but because she longed for the warmth his presence brought into every room. That evening, rain began to fall softly, just enough to blur the edges of the world. Mama Ruth stood near the window, watching the drops slide down the glass, remembering a time when rain meant stories and warm food, and Adrien curled up beside her as a boy, asking endless questions about life. It felt like another lifetime now. She didn't hear Selena approach until she felt her arm shove hard against her shoulder, sending her stumbling back. "Stop staring like a ghost," Selena snapped. "You're making the place look gloomy." There was no reason behind the harshness, just the thrill of having power over someone too gentle to fight back. When dinner time arrived, Selena made a grand meal for herself and instructed the cook to set only one plate. Mama Ruth stood nearby, hunger twisting her stomach, but she said nothing. The silence was her shield, her dignity the only treasure she would not surrender. Selena ate slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving the old woman. "I don't know why Adrien brought you here," she said casually, lifting a forkful of food. "A billionaire's life doesn't need an aging burden sitting in his shadow." The words sliced through Mama Ruth's heart, but she held her breath, letting the pain rest quietly in her chest. She had suffered far worse in her younger days. This cruelty was simply another storm she had to survive. When night deepened, the rain grew heavier, not storming but persistent, like a quiet reminder from heaven that nothing stays hidden forever. Selena grew restless, pacing the living room until her agitation found a target. With a sudden flare of malice, she grabbed Mama Ruth's thin wrist and dragged her toward the front door. "You're not sleeping here tonight," she spat. "Go find somewhere else to rot." The words were too shocking, too vicious to belong in any human heart. Mama Ruth tried to pull back gently, whispering, "Please, my child." Adrien would. But before she could finish, Selena swung the door open and shoved her into the rain. The cold hit her like a slap. Her feet slipped slightly on the wet steps, and for a moment she feared she might fall. Behind her, Selena smirked, crossed her arms, and watched her struggle with the elements as though it were entertainment. The rain soaked Mama Ruth's clothes in seconds, clinging to her fragile frame. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to steady her breaths. "You should be grateful," Selena said, leaning against the doorframe. "At least I didn't throw you out in the morning where the neighbors could see you." Then, with a final, cruel flick of her wrist, she slammed the door shut. Mama Ruth stood alone under the night sky, the rain soft but chilling, the mansion's lights fading behind her like extinguished hope. Her heart trembled not from fear of the darkness, but from the realization that the woman her son loved carried a heart capable of this. As she took her first slow step into the empty road, she whispered a prayer not for rescue but for strength. She needed to survive this night. She needed to live long enough to look into her son's eyes again and tell him, gently, that he deserved better. "Please don't fall," Lami whispered as she tightened her grip around Mama Ruth's arm, guiding her through the dimly lit yard as if the old woman were a fragile treasure she feared might slip through her fingers. Her soft words wove seamlessly into the night, blending with the last fading drops of rain that glittered on the cracked concrete. Mama Ruth didn't speak. She simply allowed herself to be led, her breath shallow, her eyes half closed, her spirit trembling between exhaustion and gratitude. She had walked into the darkness with nothing but sorrow clutched to her chest, yet here was a stranger offering warmth with a sincerity she had not tasted in years. Inside the small room Lami offered, the air smelled faintly of charcoal and soap, a scent that felt strangely comforting after the cold emptiness of the mansion she had left behind. The single bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting soft shadows on the clay-colored walls. Mama Ruth sat at the edge of the thin mattress, her fingers resting lightly on the fabric as though she feared she might stain someone else's kindness. She breathed slowly, letting the quiet seep into her bones. Outside, the rain had calmed to a gentle drizzle, tapping against the roof like a weary lullaby. Lami stood by the doorway for a moment, watching her guest with eyes filled not with curiosity, but with instinctive compassion. "You should rest now," she murmured. "The night has taken too much from you already." Her voice held no judgment, no probing questions, only the kind of understanding born from her own battles with life. Mama Ruth lifted her head slightly, a soft nod replacing the words her tired throat could not shape. Once Lami stepped out, closing the door with a quiet thud, the silence of the room pressed gently around Mama Ruth. She lay back on the mattress, feeling its unevenness beneath her shoulders. Yet strangely, the discomfort didn't bother her. After what she had endured, this small room, humble, worn, imperfect, felt like a sanctuary carved out of mercy itself. She closed her eyes and whispered a trembling prayer for the woman who had opened her door to a stranger in the rain, for the son who did not know she was gone, and for the strength to face whatever tomorrow might hold. But sleep refused to settle. Her chest tightened with each passing second as memories flickered behind her eyelids. Adrien's laughter as a child, his hand wrapped in hers as they crossed crowded streets, his promise that she would never know loneliness again. She had believed him because he had always kept his word. The thought of his pain when he discovered what happened pierced her deeper than Selena's cruelty. She curled her fingers into the blanket and whispered his name into the darkness, not in fear but in longing. Outside, Lami prepared to close her food stall for the night. She folded the wooden counter, wiped the last drops of rain from the lantern glass and secured the lock with a soft click. But as she began to walk back toward her two-room house, something pulled her gaze toward the dim window of the room she had given Mama Ruth. She paused, her heart softening. Life had not been kind to her either, losing her husband early, raising her young daughter alone, working long hours to survive. But those hardships had taught her something precious. Kindness was the only wealth that grew when shared. She gently pushed open the door to the small hallway and peeked into the guest room. Mama Ruth lay awake, her eyes open yet filled with thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. Lami stepped inside quietly. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. The old woman blinked, startled but not frightened, and offered a faint smile. "I'm trying," Mama Ruth whispered, "but the heart, it remembers too much." Lami nodded, understanding far more than she let on. She pulled the wooden stool closer and sat beside her. "Sometimes," she said in a low voice, God lets the night break us only to rebuild us with morning. Her words settled gently in the room, warm and steady. Mama Ruth's throat tightened with emotion and she clutched Lami's hand. You speak with so much wisdom, she murmured. Your mother must have raised you well. Lami shook her head slowly. Life raised me, she said. It teaches more than parents sometimes. She squeezed Mama Ruth's hand gently. But you, wherever you came from, you are carrying a pain that doesn't belong to someone of your grace. Mama Ruth's lips trembled, but she swallowed her truth. She could not reveal her son's name. She could not risk bringing trouble to Lami's doorstep. So she simply whispered, sometimes the people we trust the most forget how to be human. Lami's eyes softened with recognition. Ah, she breathed, that kind of hurt. Silence stretched between them, deep but not uncomfortable. Two women, one old, one young, united by wounds life had carved without permission. In that quiet exchange, something profound passed between them. The beginning of a bond neither had expected, stitched together not by blood, but by shared sorrow and kindness freely given. After a while, Lami rose from the stool. Rest, Mama, she said gently. Tomorrow the world will look different. Mama Ruth nodded and finally allowed her eyes to close. Lami stepped out quietly, closing the door behind her. As she walked down the small corridor, she whispered her own prayer, for the stranger whose suffering was heavier than her frail shoulders should ever carry, and for the unknown story that lay hidden behind her silence. Outside, the sky shifted slowly into the late-night calm, as though preparing the world for the storm that would come when Adrien returned home to find his mother missing. How does a heart continue to beat when it senses that something precious has been torn away from it, far beyond the reach of its protection? That question stirred through Adrien Cole's chest the moment his flight touched down earlier than scheduled, a strange uneasiness tightening around his ribs, as though the universe itself whispered a warning he was not prepared to hear. His return had been unplanned, the business conference ended sooner, and he had felt an overwhelming urge to come home to his mother, to sit with her over breakfast the way he always did, to hear her soft voice steady the chaos of his world. But as he drove through the quiet morning roads, the silence inside his car felt unusually heavy, like a storm quietly gathering beneath his ribs. The mansion gates opened slowly, revealing a house that looked exactly as he left it, polished, silent, grand, but something was undeniably off. Normally Mama Ruth would be at the entrance, waiting with a gentle smile, her hands clasped in warmth. Today there was no one. The emptiness greeted him first, a coldness that clung to the air. He stepped out of the car, his steps quickening, his breath shallow. He entered the living room, calling softly, Mama. His voice drifted upward along the staircase, lingering in corners unanswered. A subtle dread stole into his bones. Selena appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed elegantly, her hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. Her eyes widened in a flicker of surprise, too quick, too carefully controlled. Adrien, you're back early, she said, her tone warm yet strained, as if each word had to fight its way through discomfort. He did not answer her greeting. Where is my mother? He asked, his voice steady but darker than Selena expected. Her hands tightened slightly on the railing. She hesitated, and that single pause struck him like a blade. Selena's expression softened into something meant to resemble worry. Oh, she must still be resting. She wasn't feeling well yesterday. Adrien stepped closer, searching her face, sensing the lie behind the softness. Resting where? He asked. His voice carried a sharpness she could not easily deflect. Before she could respond, he turned away, moving quickly toward his mother's bedroom. Selena followed, each step punctuated with quiet panic. Adrien pushed open the door, expecting to see his mother lying peacefully, but the bed was neatly made, untouched. Her scarf was missing. Her reading glasses were gone. The subtle scent of lavender she carried everywhere had faded. Something inside him cracked. He spun back toward Selena, his voice low but shaking with controlled fury. Where is she? Selena swallowed hard. I told you she wasn't feeling well. Maybe she stepped out for some fresh air. You know how she is. Don't, he cut in sharply. Don't lie to me. The tremor in his voice betrayed the war happening behind his stern expression. He walked past her and headed for the kitchen, where the maid, Chica, stood frozen between fear and guilt the moment she saw him. She dropped her gaze instantly, wringing her hands. "Chica," Adrien said, his tone soft but broken, "where is my mother?" For a moment, silence ruled the room. Chica's chest rose and fell rapidly, her eyes darting towards Selena, who stepped into the kitchen doorway with a cold, warning glint buried beneath her smile. But Chica could not hold the truth inside her heart any longer, not when the man who treated the staff with dignity stood before her looking like a son on the edge of collapse. Her voice trembled. "Sir, your mother, she left last night." Adrien's lips parted slightly, his breath uneven. "Left to where?" Tears formed in Chica's eyes as she shook her head. "She didn't say, sir." And then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, she was crying. The words detonated inside him. Selena quickly stepped forward. "Adrien, I tried to stop her. She was acting irrational." He turned toward her sharply, and for the first time since he met her, she saw something in his eyes that terrified her clarity. He studied her face with a depth that stripped away every carefully constructed lie. Without a word, he walked away, heading straight for the security room. He reviewed the cameras with trembling hands. There, in grainy footage illuminated by rainlight, he watched his mother step out of the mansion at night, frail, wet, alone, her shawl clinging desperately to her shoulders. He watched her leave. He watched her walk into the storm. He watched as the door closed behind her from the inside. His breath shattered. He rose, his entire body trembling, the weight of betrayal crashing through him with brutal force. Without looking back at Selena, he marched toward the garage. "Adrien, listen," she called after him, but he didn't stop. He didn't hear her. All he could hear were the echoes of the rain that had beaten against his mother's body while he was miles away, believing she was safe. He started the car with unsteady hands and drove out into the city, searching for her through every road, every corner, every cluster of street vendors just beginning their morning routine. His eyes scanned faces desperately, his heart pounding with the fear of a man who had just realized that the person he loved most might be lost in a world too harsh for her gentle soul. He whispered into the empty car, voice breaking, "Mama, please be safe." And somewhere across the city, in a small leaking room, Mama Ruth slept through the early light, unaware that her son was tearing the world apart to find her. The moment Adrien spotted the familiar patterned shawl folded neatly at the edge of a roadside gutter, his entire world shifted, as though the ground beneath him recognized the weight of his fear and buckled in sympathy. He slammed the brakes, stumbling out of the car before it had fully stopped, his breath shattering in the cold morning air. That shawl, soft lavender, embroidered with tiny white threads, was the one his mother wrapped around her shoulders every night when the weather cooled. Seeing it lying abandoned on the wet pavement felt like witnessing a wound carved into the city itself. He bent slowly, his fingers trembling as he lifted the damp fabric, bringing it to his chest with a quiet gasp he couldn't restrain. It was the closest he had come to finding her, yet the sight of it deepened the ache instead of easing it. People around the marketplace watched him quietly, unsure of the story behind the frantic man in luxury clothes kneeling beside a gutter in deep anguish. Adrien didn't notice their stares, his heart beat too wildly, consumed by the fear that he had come too late. The breeze carried distant sounds, vendors calling prices, the clatter of stalls being opened, the faint murmur of morning prayers. But to him, everything sounded far away, muffled beneath the pounding in his chest. He rose slowly, scanning every face he could see, searching desperately for a sign, any sign, that his mother might have passed through this area. He approached the nearest vendor, an elderly man arranging oranges on a wooden table. "Sir, please," Adrien said, his voice raw, "did you see an older woman walking here last night, frail, soaked from the rain, wearing something like this?" He held up the shawl, his hand shaking uncontrollably. The old vendor squinted, studying him carefully, then shook his head with regret. "I closed early, my son. The rain was too heavy." Adrien nodded, swallowing disappointment that lodged like a stone in his throat. He moved from one stall to another, asking, begging, describing his mother with a desperation that chipped away at his composure. Most had seen nothing. A few offered sympathy. One woman shook her head and murmured, "So much hardship in this city, I hope you find her, sir." Her words only deepened the heaviness in his chest. He tightened his grip on the shawl and whispered under his breath, "Mama, where are you?" Meanwhile, inside Lami's small room on the outskirts of the same district, Mama Ruth stirred awake slowly. A gentle warmth brushed across her face, sunlight slipping timidly through the cracks in the patched roof. The scent of warm millet porridge drifted in through the open doorway, carrying with it a quiet comfort she had not felt in days. She blinked against the light, her body aching but safe. The thin mattress beneath her felt softer than any silk bed she had ever known, not because of its material, but because it carried the warmth of kindness. Lami stepped into the room carrying a steaming bowl. "Good morning, Mama," she said softly. "I hope you slept a little." Mama Ruth pushed herself up slowly, leaning against the wall as she nodded. "I slept more peacefully than I expected," she whispered. Her eyes softened as she looked at Lami. "You gave a stranger refuge last night. I will never forget that." Lami smiled shyly. "I only did what a person should do. Anyone deserving of respect should never face a storm alone." Her voice held a simple truth that felt like balm on Mama Ruth's wounded heart. As Mama Ruth raised the spoon to her lips, her mind drifted involuntarily to Adrien. She wondered if he had returned home yet. She wondered how his heart was holding up. She wondered whether he had discovered her absence and what explanation Selena might have offered. The thought twisted inside her chest until she closed her eyes to steady herself. She whispered a prayer beneath her breath, "Lord, guide my son, let no harm come to his spirit." Across the city, Adrien's steps grew heavier with each passing minute. After hours of searching through the marketplace, he finally stopped near a small kiosk where a young boy was stacking cartons. "Excuse me," Adrien said, exhaustion choking his voice. "Did you see an older woman pass here late at night? She might have been crying, maybe shivering from cold." The boy hesitated, then slowly nodded. "I didn't see her face clearly," he said, "but I saw someone walking toward the small wooden stalls near the old food stand. She looked weak. I thought she might faint." Hope flickered in Adrien's heart, small, fragile, but alive. "Which direction?" he asked urgently. The boy pointed, and Adrien immediately hurried toward the row of wooden stalls tucked along the edge of the street. The closer he got, the more his heartbeat quickened. The stalls were old, patched, worn places where only the humble labored. He walked past each one, scanning every corner, looking for the smallest hint of his mother's presence. Near the last stall he noticed something, a lantern still hanging by the door, faint traces of steam rising from a bucket of water beside it. Someone had been awake here recently. He approached and knocked gently on the wooden frame. Inside, Lami looked up in surprise. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the entrance. When she opened the door, she saw a tall man standing there, clutching a lavender shawl soaked from rain and heartbreak. His eyes were filled with a desperation she recognized instantly, a desperation born from love. "Good morning," Lami said cautiously. "Can I help you?" Adrien swallowed hard, fighting the rising ache. "Please," he whispered, "I'm looking for my mother." The way Adrien's voice broke on the word mother made something shift in Lami's chest, as though two souls with wounds in different places had suddenly been stitched together by a single thread of shared humanity. She stepped aside quietly, motioning for him to enter the small stall, the soft morning light spilling around them like a gentle witness to the fragile moment unfolding. Adrien hesitated at the doorway, gripping his mother's shawl so tightly the fabric trembled in his hands. His breaths came unevenly, as though each inhale carried the fear of losing the woman who had raised him with every heartbeat she possessed. Lami watched him closely, her eyes softening with understanding. "Sit," she murmured, "let me get you water." But Adrien shook his head, his gaze darting around the tiny room, taking in the wooden shelves, the neatly folded napkins, the small cot near the far wall, as though searching for signs of his mother in every corner. He swallowed hard. "Is she here?" he whispered, his voice carrying equal parts hope and terror. Lami exhaled gently. She is safe, she said with a softness that steadied the air. She is resting in the next room. The world stopped spinning for him. For a moment he couldn't move. Relief washed over him so suddenly that his knees weakened, and he had to steady himself against the table. Lami opened the door to the back room and called softly, "Mama, someone is here to see you." Mama Ruth stirred, her frail figure shifting beneath the worn blanket. When her eyes opened and she saw Adrien standing in the doorway, his suit damp with sweat and rain, his eyes glistening with tears he hadn't dared shed before, her breath caught in her throat. She pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed. "My son," she whispered. Adrien fell to his knees beside the bed before she could rise. His hands wrapped around hers with a desperation that spoke of sleepless hours and an ache no wealth in the world could soften. "Mama," he choked out, his voice shaking. "I've been looking everywhere, I thought," but his words dissolved into a tremor as he bowed his head against her palm. Mama Ruth cradled his face gently, her thumb brushing away a tear. "I'm here," she murmured. "I'm here, my child. God guided my steps." Adrien lifted his head, pain etched deeply across his features. "Why did you leave the house? What happened?" His voice broke again. "What did she do to you?" Mama Ruth hesitated. She looked toward Lami, who stood quietly near the doorway, unsure whether to remain or step out. Mama Ruth squeezed Adrien's hand and lowered her gaze. She had never wanted to burden him with her suffering. She had always believed in protecting his peace, not shaking it. But looking into his eyes now raw, wounded, desperate for truth, she realized silence would only wound him further. "She pushed me out," Mama Ruth whispered finally, "into the rain." The silence that followed felt like the world inhaled sharply and held its breath, afraid of what his heart might do with the truth. Adrien's face drained of color, his jaw clenched, and a trembling rage rose from a place in him he did not know existed. He swallowed hard, gripping the bedsheet as though anchoring himself from breaking. "She threw you out," he breathed, disbelief shattering inside him. "My own fiancée." Mama Ruth closed her eyes. "I didn't want to tell you, but yes, she did." For a moment, Adrien could not speak. His breaths came heavier, more uneven, as though every inhale scraped past the sharp edges of betrayal. Then slowly he rose to his feet, his entire body trembling from the storm gathering beneath his ribs. Lami stepped forward cautiously. "Please," she said softly, "sit. Anger can damage a man's soul if held too tightly." Adrien turned toward her, and for the first time he truly saw Lami, the woman who had sheltered his mother without knowing she belonged to a billionaire, the woman who had offered warmth to a stranger with nothing to offer in return. Gratitude surged through him like a tide, and he lowered his head. "Thank you," he said, the words thick with emotion. "You saved the most important person in my life. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Lami shook her head gently. "You owe me nothing. Your mother needed help. Anyone with a heart would have done the same." But he knew better. Not everyone would. Later, after ensuring Mama Ruth was strong enough to move, Adrien helped her to the car. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting a soft golden glow across the humble compound. Before they left, Adrien turned back to Lami. "I will never forget this place," he said, "nor the kindness I found within its walls." Lami smiled warmly but said nothing. Her humility didn't allow grand speeches. Inside the car, Mama Ruth leaned her head gently against the seat, her fingers wrapped softly around her son's hand. "Adrien," she whispered, "don't let pain turn your heart dark." He shook his head slowly. "No, Mama, but I will not let cruelty hide behind love." His eyes hardened, not with bitterness, but with a clarity that would soon change everything. As he drove away with her, a vow settled quietly in his chest. Selena would answer for what she had done, and the world would know what kind of woman had almost stolen his mother's dignity. But before justice came a far more important truth. Adrien had found his mother again, and that alone had changed the course of his world.